I see lots of familiar faces and familiar names. Carolyn, there is a print in Helena awaiting your pickup. Instructions to follow. Janet, thank you for your very nice note. Good to see you. Um,
Good to be here.
I I don't think I'm supposed to have us sing happy birthday to George Bristol, but George is with us tonight from Texas. George is our December artist with his amazing book, Culmination of Giants. And so I think, George, you may be turning 80 today. Am I correct in that assumption?
You got it.
All right, my friend, congratulations.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here in more ways than one.
Right, it's better than the alternative, isn't it?
That's right.
Nora, thanks for joining in from Great Falls. I take it you have Randy in good shape there somewhere?
Actually, he's out doing some work on our cabin. He's doing some cement work. So
okay.
I do have him in a good place.
Nora and Randy were Julie's and my roommates at Granite Park Chalet a couple of years ago when we were able to be up there before they opened. We were their soft opening guests. And we drank bottle number 1 of Wheeler of the Spirit of Sperry. And I actually have it still in my office refilled, Nora, for the reunion.
Good for you.
And as people on this call who know me well, the idea of me drinking vodka is kind of an anathema. So it was a very little, I might have thrown it over my shoulder. Well, thanks everybody for joining again for Glacier Book Club. It's just a delight to have you with us and to be joined tonight by Marc Johnson, the author of this incredible book that celebrates the life and times of really one of the iconic members of the United States Senate and clearly one of the iconic historic figures in Montana, Burton K. Wheeler. So Marc, thank you for joining us. Marc is joining us from Oregon. His journey to Oregon is somewhat circuitous, and really, although Marc has been involved in politics and writes about politics, I will say his journey did not really do a good job of anticipating electoral victory. Starting in Nebraska with its 5 electoral votes, he moved to Wyoming with its 3, and then went to college in South Dakota, also with its 3 at South Dakota State, and then moved to Idaho, where Idaho also has its 3, where he was the chief of staff. Always my dream job to be chief of staff to a governor. I'm never able to get that job. And Marc was the chief of staff for iconic governor and Secretary of the Interior later, Cecil Andrus, and now is living on the North Oregon coast. So, Marc, thank you for joining the Glacier Book Club tonight and for spending some time with us.
Really a pleasure, Doug. Thank you, and thanks to Jill and Emily and Nick for facilitating the conversation. I'm looking forward to it.
So, so tell us so what interested you in Wheeler as a subject, Marc?
Well, Doug, I've always been interested in that period in American political history between the 2 world wars, and I've read a good deal about it, continue to read a good deal about it. Very interested in the Franklin Roosevelt presidency, Great Depression period, and the Western progressives of that era, of which Wheeler was certainly a very prominent member. And there were progressives in both political parties for sure in that period. And I'd become interested in people like Tom Walsh from Montana and William Borah from Idaho. And so it was natural to gravitate toward Wheeler. I started looking around for the Wheeler biography many years ago, discovered his own book, but that no full-length treatment had ever been undertaken of his life. So I sort of got interested in the story, and the more I read about him and the more I understood the arc of his political career, the more interesting it became. And I love Montana, so it was a natural for me to try to write that book.
So how long did it take you kind of start to finish?
Well, I started when I was 12 years old, I think, and it took a long time. Actually, I probably worked on it for close to 20 years. I stopped a few times. I was still trying to hold down a full-time day job and writing when I could on weekends and that sort of thing. And it wasn't really until we moved to the Oregon coast about 5 years or so ago that I really had a concentrated period of time to really finish it. So, but I worked on it off and on for a long, long time, and then really intensely for a couple of years prior to its publication last year.
And so talk to us a little bit about kind of that writing process. How does that work for you? Do you sit down and write a page a day? Do you do a bunch of research and have index cards and then it all comes together and you write for a week? What does that look like for you?
Well, I sort of invented my own style with the Wheeler book, and I've refined it for a book that is in process right now and will come out next year from the University of Oklahoma Press. Another book on Senate history. But yeah, I sort of backed into writing about Wheeler by making lots of notes on index cards, finally deciding that that was a good method for me. I have since refined it to the point where I do a pretty extensive outline of what I think the book will look like. And then I use that outline to kind of assemble the various bits and pieces of research, try to get it all in the same place at the same time, and then sort through it, so to speak, to create the narrative. But yeah, it takes a long time. Once I get that original tranche of research done, then I usually try to set myself a goal to write at least 1,000 words a day when I'm trying to really write it, which is not a lot. It's basically two pages or so, single space pages, and 1,000 words a day. You can write a lot in a fairly short period of time when you're having that kind of a goal in mind.
Yeah, that's super cool. So additional people are joining us. Thanks again. We're with Marc Johnson talking about Political Hellraiser, his book published last year. University of Oklahoma, that's the
University of Oklahoma Press, Norman, Oklahoma.
And for folks who we really want this to be a discussion, so we sent out some discussion guide questions for people to think about. Feel free to kind of weigh in. I'll try and guide some of those a little bit, but just unmute yourself and talk, or if you want to use the chat box to say I've got a question, or just type in your question, we'll go ahead and ask those for you as well. And then Marc has been gracious enough. It's kind of awkward because we all buy the book and read the book before we have the meeting with the author. So he is gracious enough to allow us to send him some book plates, so that if you'd like to have the book you own inscribed to you, just use the chat feature, which is in the bottom center if you're not on your 7th Zoom call of the day. It's in the bottom middle, and you can just put how you'd like it, to Randy and Nora, and we will make sure that Marc will do those, and we'll get them back to us, and we'll get them out to you guys. So feel free to do that, and thank you, Marc, for agreeing to do that for our—
Indeed, happy to do it.
Yeah, for our book club folks. So, one of the first questions that kind of we launched, and Nicholas Midler, who's been helping us out with this, kind of put that together about, here's a guy who is a maverick, who went down a number of interesting paths as we now look at them in our rearview mirror, 70 and 80 years later, 80 plus years later. What kind of, for book club members, what kind of were you taken, what were you surprised about? What kind of those maverick moves in Wheeler's political career kind of had you calling your spouse over and say, let me read you this section? What surprised you?
Well, I think there are many things that surprised me about Wheeler's career, but predominantly, I would say, most interesting to me, particularly given our politics today, was his really lack of being tied to his party. He was the definition of a political maverick, I think. A Democrat for sure, all of his life, with the exception of when even when he bolted the Democratic Party in 1924 to run on the Progressive Party ticket as the vice presidential candidate, he still called himself a Democrat. And he always thought of himself as a Democrat, but he was not in any way a party man. He made many, many different relationships across the political aisle and way beyond what we would think as the bounds of democratic politics, even in the 1920s and 30s. He had a close personal friendship with Norman Thomas, the perennial Socialist Party presidential candidate. Senator Borah from Idaho, a progressive Republican, was one of his closest friends in the Senate. He left his own campaign in 1934 to go to Wisconsin to campaign with Robert La Follette Jr., a Republican, and endorsed him openly. Endorsed Senator McNary in Oregon, who was the Republican leader of the Senate. So this guy was unfettered by party bounds, by party binds, bound to his party. And that's a fascinating thing when you think about how polarized our politics are today, that you did have people like Wheeler and Borah and others who really worked kind of seamlessly across the political divide. They would be with, Wheeler would be with a Republican on one issue, maybe opposed to him on another, but they found a way oftentimes to work together on things that were of mutual interest. So that was very, very interesting to me. He clearly had a economic view that was not unique to his times by any means, but he was anti-big banks, he was anti-Wall Street. He led the charge in the Senate in 1935 to break up the big utility holding companies. 13 utility holding companies dominated the American electric utility industry in the 1930s. And as much as anyone in politics at that time, he was responsible for bringing about the dissolution of those utility holding companies, which was a major restructuring of the American economy. Those 13 utility holding companies controlled something like 85% of all the electric power distribution in the country. And they were kind of machines for making a lot of money for a handful of people and not delivering very good service to American consumers. And so it says something about his view of the ability of government and regulation to bring corporate power to heel, that he was engaged in that kind of a fight. So those are just a couple of examples, Doug, of where I thought he was, really a fascinating character.
So since I know I can put my pal George Bristol on the spot here. George, you are also a political historian and have been involved in kind of this game. Do you think we could have a Burton K. Wheeler in the United States Senate today?
I don't think he'd last very long among his peers, because it's so, as Mark said, it's so partisan on both sides of the aisle that even Biden recently, within the last 6 months, said how much he liked some Republican senator back when he got along, and he got a little pushback, a little criticism for it. So they talk a good game, and every once in a while, and we're the benefactors of that, every once in a while they get together and do something right with, like the Great American Outdoor Act. That goes all the way back to Lyndon Johnson. It was a bipartisan bill in 1964. When it passed, it's been shepherded through Congress. Sometimes they failed, sometimes they put money in. But over the years, by a bipartisan group of mainly senators in that particular case. But on the other hand, they put enough money in there. They were supposed to get $900 million every single year for the rest of eternity. And Congress often found ways to spend that money better, at least in their opinion. So now we've got a permanent and a sustainable source of money for the foreseeable future. And that was bipartisan, but for the most part, you can't go up to New York or Idaho or wherever and endorse the Republican candidate or the Democratic candidate. You walk back in, they'll take your committees away from you, which we've seen happen, et cetera. So it's a tough, rough ball game.
Yeah, it's interesting. So, I mean, I think that we kind of, you hear talk about the lions, right? The lions of the Senate, and they're talking about, you know, Bob Byrd and Howard Baker and you know, we're in the House, Tip O'Neill. Mark, do you think we, you know, is the era of the lions over?
I hate to say it, but I think it may be. And one of the reasons, and George put his finger on it, is the super partisanship that exists in the Senate now. And I believe a lack of institutional respect for the Senate as an institution. The kind of respect that I think somebody like a Wheeler in his day, or a Max Baucus in his day, or a Mike Mansfield in his day had for the Senate as an institution. A respect for the role that the Senate uniquely plays in the American political system. And I see too many people in both political parties who are willing to sort of disregard the institutional importance of the Senate. And that, you know, that makes it difficult to, you know, come up with legislation. It makes it difficult to work across the political aisle. It makes it easy to upset the norms of how the Senate is supposed to operate. A lot of talk right now about doing away with the filibuster entirely, which I suspect will probably happen in the not too distant future, regardless of which party controls the Senate. In Wheeler's day, you know, the filibuster was very, very seldomly used. It was considered sort of an affront to the institution to prolong debate on something, even like something as controversial as the Lend-Lease legislation in 1941, which Wheeler fought to the bitter end against. But there was no real thought among Wheeler and his colleagues that they were going to invoke the filibuster to try to stop that legislation. That's just not the way the Senate was supposed to operate. So yeah, a lot of the norms have gone out the window, and a lot of the institutional respect has been badly eroded.
Feel free, everyone, to ask questions. We have a question from Janet about why did you choose Oklahoma University Press?
Well, it's a long story. I'll try to make it short. An acquisitions editor who worked for the University of Oklahoma Press is a fellow by the name of Chuck Rankin, who now lives in Helena. Chuck had been a editor of Montana, the Magazine of Western History, the great journal of the State Historical Society. And I got connected with Chuck when he was sort of in the last phase of his career, having worked as the editor-in-chief of the University of Oklahoma Press. He was very, very interested in the Wheeler story from the first time that I mentioned it to him. And he championed the book with his colleagues at the press. The University of Oklahoma has, for a long time, has had a niche in publishing Western history. They published a number of books by Ross Toole, among other Montana writers. So they have a real niche in Western history and political history. So it was a natural fit, and I'm delighted that they're going to publish another book of mine early next year.
Can you give us a sneak peek, or are you sworn to secrecy?
No, I'm happy to talk about it. I'm just waiting for the page proofs to come back, which I hope to have this month. The book is entitled Tuesday Night Massacre, 4 Senate Elections and the Radicalization of the Republican Party. It centers on 4 U.S. Senate races in 1980, races in Idaho, Iowa, Indiana, and South Dakota, where some of those lions of the Senate, people like George McGovern, Frank Church in Idaho, Birch Bayh in Indiana, were defeated by the very earliest example of what we now call an independent expenditure campaign, where an outside group comes into a state. These are absolutely de rigueur in American politics, but in 1980 they were still it was still forming as a tactic, and really pretty disreputable campaigns were run against all four of those incumbents. The Senate flipped in 1980 for the first time in 25 years to Republican control. And I think a lot of what we see in our politics now, you can trace back to the roots of those campaigns in 1980. So that's what the book is about.
That's going to be super interesting. You know, I think that, you know, I've always threatened to write a book, but that would require my being able to write, called How Dirk Kempthorne Broke the Senate. But when we were campaigning in '96 for Max, all of a sudden an incumbent United States senator showed up in our state to campaign against Max, and it's just not done, right? But like independent expenditure campaigns, there was this new breed who just didn't cotton to the old way of doing things. And now, of course, nobody thinks twice when that happens. But yeah, it's super interesting. Well, I would be bereft if I did not, in my responsibilities, if I did not show a photograph of the Wheeler cabin. One of the reasons that I chose Marc's book for the book club was we're working on what I think is a very important, iconic project, which is the restoration of Burton K and Lulu Wheeler's cabin on Lake Macdonald. I actually took this picture 2 weeks ago on a Friday night. Julie and I were there. And extra credit for anybody who can use the memo field and tell me what kind of flower that is. Not native to Glacier National Park, so this must have been either planted there or blown in from a fire. But the cabin is, we have a grant application to the state. We've been raising money and doing projects one by one. The cabin now has a well. With any luck, by the end of the year, that well will be connected to the house. Seems like a good thing, both for fire protection and as the next step to being able to really resurrect this property and be able to have that kind of experience that Senator Wheeler and his family were able to have. And also, I have this vision in my head of some peace treaty, some international treaty being signed there someday. So, Nora, very well done on the Foxglove. Excellent. Yes, indeed, that is correct. So that's the Wheeler cabin as it currently sits. If you get a chance to be in the park, come take a look. Best rock skipping available. And I see that my friend Carolyn has raised her hand.
Yeah, I have a question for Marc.
Yay.
Marc, I am an Idahoan, and I was not expecting so much Idaho, some love, some not so much love on this call, but and a big C. Sanders fan. So my question for you, and I apologize, I did not have time to Google you before this call. One, is this your first book? And two, I was really impressed with your voice in this book. I sort of groan when I look at when it's time to read like historical texts, but I found this to be very readable and a really nice read. And I didn't know if you had given any thought to that in writing this book.
Well, that's very kind of you to say. I appreciate it very much. It is my first book, and the process of doing it was, in a way, an effort to discover my own voice, I guess, about how I did want to approach writing history. And my long ago, my training, college degree is in journalism. And I was a reporter for about 10 years in Idaho, mostly television reporting, but tried to master the craft of writing as a journalist. And I tend to write more as a journalist than not. And I do value the idea that, you can tell a good story and still be faithful to the scholarship behind the history. So your very kind comments mean a lot to me. Thank you very much. I'm a
Thank
big
you.
fan of C. Sanders's too. He
Yep.
hired me in 1985 to work on his campaign when he was coming back from being Interior Secretary and running for governor the third time. And I worked on that campaign, then became his press secretary and later his chief of staff. And then for many years afterward, continued the association with him in a variety of different ways. So he was a wonderful, wonderful guy.
Quite an honor.
Thanks. Thanks for being a part of this tonight.
So Paul has asked a question about kind of to all of us, if whether we think that the increasing presence of women and minorities might improve the decorum of the Senate, and also kind of tangentially, did Senators McCain and Kennedy, were they successful at kind of reaching across the aisle?
Well, the first part of that question, I think my answer would be yes, it will improve the sort of the atmosphere and the comedy of American politics to have more women and people of color involved. I don't think there's any doubt, in my mind, there's no doubt about that. I think one of the positive things that happens in the United States Senate right now, for example, is that the female senators in both parties tend to get along really, really well with each other. Even when they are at loggerheads on some political issue, they still have personal relationships that transcend the partisanship. And Doug, you know from working on a Senate staff that those personal relationships still amount to a lot. They count for a lot. And to be able to foster those relationships, I think is critical. So yeah, I think generally speaking, more women in all kinds of leadership positions is a capital idea, and we should get behind it in every conceivable way.
Mark, you said something that I think is one of the leading problems in modern politics as it applies to Washington. And that was up until the late 60s, the Senate and the House used to adjourn by the 4th of July, period. And so they lived at hotels and they ate dinner together, Republicans and Democrats. They had each other out to each other's houses. There was a lot of personal camaraderie. It was brought to my attention as a young congressional aide when I saw Lyndon Johnson and Everett Dirksen talking to each other at a garden party, and they were having the best time of their lives. That camaraderie has totally left because people leave, go home to campaign. They don't, the partisanship doesn't allow people to go to each other's house for dinner. I think it's one of the great ruinous things that have happened to the to the elective process.
You know, I completely agree with that. All that you said. You know, there are members of the United States Senate and House of Representatives who never moved their families to Washington, D.C. They live in, sort of isolation, moving from their district or their state back to Washington, D.C. on Tuesday morning and flying back to their state on Friday morning. So they don't have any sort of connection to the place and the relationships that go along with that. In Wheeler's era and long after his era, they, Mr. and Mrs. Wheeler, Senator and Mrs. Wheeler were big at entertaining, holding dinner parties at their home. I mentioned in the book that Huey Long was a frequent guest at their dinner table, but so were members of the cabinet, other members of Congress from both political parties. They had those kinds of personal relationships with each other. The Wheelers regularly went to Justice Louis Brandeis's apartment on Sunday for Brandeis's salon where, tea was served and they talked about the great issues of the day. So that kind of thing is the personal relationships is the lubricant that makes politics work in a lot of ways. And when you remove that because people don't have a connection to the institution or other people who are part of the institution, it makes it much, much more difficult to have those kinds of personal relationships. I'll just tell you one quick story from my forthcoming book that I thought is so illustrative of how the Senate has changed. Birch Bayh from Indiana, Democrat, elected in 1962 to the Senate. Everett Dirksen from Illinois, a Republican, state next door, is the Senate Minority Leader. The two of them are on the presidential yacht, the Sequoia, in the Potomac for a social occasion. And the first time really that Dirksen and the young senator from Indiana, Birch Bayh, had a chance to talk, Dirksen says to Bayh, "Come over here and sit down and tell me about your campaign." He had just been elected. And by the end of the evening, Dirksen is saying, "We have to make sure that you come back here in 6 years." So imagine a Republican leader of the Senate saying that to a freshman Democrat today. It just would not happen. And there was a respect for the institution and the people in the institution that somehow, some way, we have to try to recapture some of that, I think.
So we have another participant raising his hand with what I'm going to call a screen name mismatch, because I'm pretty sure it's not Maria.
Thank you so much. My name's Ed Wilson. I'm joining you all from North Carolina.
Hey, Ed.
That's my daughter's screen name, I guess. But I've never been in your book club, so it's nice to be here. I'm an admirer of Jimmy Carter. I think he was a great president, and I wonder if Mr. Johnson would talk about, he did so much for the environment. I wonder if Mr. Johnson might talk a moment about what Governor Andrus was able to do as Interior Secretary.
Well, thank you, Ed, for the question. I don't make any pretext to being objective about C. Andrus. I think he was one of a handful of 3 or 4 truly great interior secretaries in American history. I would put Roosevelt's Interior Secretary, Harold Ickes, in that group. I would put Stu Udall from the Kennedy and Johnson administration in that group, and certainly my old boss, Governor and Secretary Andrus. There is no way to sugarcoat the reality that the Carter administration, with C. Andrus in the lead position, accomplished the greatest conservation legislation in the history of the country, the creation of the Alaska, all the parks, the wildlife refuges, the solving of the Alaska lands issue, if you will, which had eluded Congress from the time that Alaska was admitted as a state in 1959 until the time that they accomplished it in 1980. A great, great environmental legacy that ranks up there, if not exceeds, some of the things that Theodore Roosevelt was able to do. So it was a great, great environmental accomplishment, something that President Carter personally doesn't get as much credit for it as he deserves, because he really empowered his Secretary of the Interior to undertake that effort, backed it at every step of the way, and used the power of the presidency to get it done. It's easy to forget that legislation passed in the lame duck session of Congress after the 1980 election, when everybody in the country, everybody in the world knew that a conservative Republican, Ronald Reagan, was coming into office. The Senate was going to be controlled by Republicans for the first time in 25 years. And still, there was enough support for the creation of that Alaska legacy that they were able to get it done in a lame duck session of Congress. A remarkable, remarkable accomplishment. Thanks for the question.
Super interesting, and to kind of go back a little bit to the book itself, I think if you're a Montanan and you want everything to work out great, you get a little bit of discomfort as you see Wheeler continue to go down this path of isolationism, right? And you start to be a little uncomfortable with Lindbergh, and so talk a little bit about how you made the decision and how you dealt with that. I felt like you dealt with that in such a forthright way that was not either accusatory or apologetic. So, but clearly you understood that has has emotional connotations. So how did you deal with that? What was kind of your thought process, Mark?
Well, it is the defining legacy, Doug, of Wheeler, to the extent that he is, remembered very much at all outside of Montana now. It's because he was the focus in the United States Senate of opposition to Franklin Roosevelt's foreign policy, beginning in 1940 and certainly carrying through until the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. He was the face in the Senate of opposition to every single initiative that Roosevelt undertook in that period, from creating the first peacetime conscription, the draft in 1940, renewing the draft in 1941, passing the Lend-Lease legislation, which I mentioned earlier, early in 1941, which I think most historians of that period now would say was absolutely a critical step to keeping Great Britain afloat and able to carry on against, the Nazi onslaught. And Wheeler opposed every single one of those efforts. For me, it was the most difficult part of the story to understand and to write. And finally, I just convinced myself, well, you got to let the story go where it goes, and try to understand what his motivations were, but also understand what the consequences were of had he prevailed in his view of what might have happened. So I completely discount the idea that he was any kind of a Nazi sympathizer or a secret fascist or something like that. He was not. He was very, very much anti-war, which dated back to his time in Butte as the United States Attorney during the First World War, where he saw all kinds of excesses, people deprived of their civil liberties, people jailed for their political beliefs being against the war, violence, the murder of Frank Little, among others. And that, I believe, was the defining moment in his political development when he came to believe that there was nothing possibly good that could come to the United States out of being involved in a war. And he believed that the first U.S. involvement in the First World War was a major, major mistake, that the Second World War was largely a consequence of the economic problems that had arisen and the continuing imperialism that had come out of World War I, and he was determined to try to keep the United States from being involved in that. So understanding his motives, as I think I do, and as I hope I convey in the book, you also have to acknowledge that had his view prevailed, you have to understand that it's entirely possible that Nazi Germany would have controlled Western Europe for the foreseeable future, that maybe Britain would not have been able to stay in the war against Germany. And who knows what the consequences of that would have been. Wheeler was much more concerned for US national security purposes with the threat posed by Japan in the Pacific than he was by what Germany posed in Western Europe. And when finally in 1941, the summer of 1941, when Hitler turns against the Soviet Union and invades Russia, Wheeler's attitude is basically let the dictators fight it out among themselves. So he was very much opposed to war and very kind of in the tradition of another great Montana figure, Jeanette Rankin, who was a pacifist. I won't go so far as to call Wheeler a pacifist, but he was very, very much opposed to war, what he thought was the coercive nature of a country at war, when people were impressed, in his view, impressed into military service against their will, where civil liberties were trampled, where free speech was, imperiled. So he took a very dogmatic view of that, needless to say. And he associated himself as a result of that with some characters that you might look back and say, well, that's not the company that you might naturally want to associate with. And I didn't find any evidence that Wheeler and Charles Lindbergh, for example, had anything other than a very transactional relationship. They basically both abhorred Roosevelt's foreign policy and consequently made common cause with each other to battle that foreign policy. I don't think, I think it's fanciful to think that they had some sort of notion that they were going to, form a third party or something and run as a ticket, as Philip Roth's Plot Against America suggests. So I'll just leave it at that. Say Wheeler was vehemently against war. And he continued to be throughout the rest of his life. He opposed U.S. involvement in Korea. He adamantly opposed U.S. intervention in South Vietnam. And celebrated the fact that his opposition to that was, he had been consistent in his opposition to war from 1917 until his death.
Mark, this is George Bristol.
Yeah, go, George.
This is for Mark or anybody else from Montana. What do you think were the ingredients of Montana that led so many of their politicians to be pacifist, anti-war, what have you? What was the makeup of the electorate at the time?
Well, I think there's probably several threads there. One was the Irish American influence in Butte and elsewhere. Wheeler always counted on the Irish vote, as he would call it, out of Butte, his political base. And most people of Irish descent then, as now, had a dim view of Great Britain.
Yeah.
And did not believe that the British Empire was in any way a benign institution, that it had put the thumb of British imperialism on the throat or on the neck of Ireland for generations. So part of it is that. Part of it is the prevailing sentiment after World War I, not only in Montana, but in other parts of the country, generally speaking, was to kind of withdraw from the world's affairs. There was a widespread belief that the First World War had been a war about preserving the British Empire, preserving the French Empire in Africa and the Middle East, and that was not something the United States ought to be involved in. So there's a strong isolationist thread that runs through the American West and the Midwest in this period. And that continued, frankly, right up until the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. I went back and looked at the Gallup polls from that period, which consistently were asking questions about, should the United States become involved in World War II? What would cause the United States to be involved? And there was a strong, strong sentiment right up until the Japanese attack that the United States should not be involved in another world war. So even though President Roosevelt, I think in a very, very constructive, in some cases a very duplicitous way, was engineering the United States to move ever more steadily toward engagement in the war, to give him his due, because I think he saw Nazi Germany as an existential threat to Western civilization, if you will. And he was determined to find a way to battle it. But up until the time that the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, there was no sentiment in the country that the United States ought to become, no majority sentiment in the country that the United States ought to become involved in World War II. And you might argue that one of Adolf Hitler's great blunders was to actually declare war on the United States, because the United States may not have declared war on Germany had Hitler not taken that initiative shortly after Pearl Harbor.
So, Mark, I want to ask, Nicholas put together a really interesting question, I thought, about whether Washington changed Wheeler, right? So we see a guy who just calls him as he sees him when he's the U.S. attorney, goes to the Senate kind of in the same way. But by 1938, he is a politician's politician, right? He's making sure that he's not going to get O'Connell as his opponent in 1940. And so he seems much more of an inside player. Did you sense that Washington changed Wheeler, or was he really that guy all along?
I think he was that guy all along. I don't see much evidence that being in Washington, being a figure in the Senate, really changed him all that much. I think he came to embrace that role and to really enjoy that role. He thought of himself very much as one of the barons, if you will, of the Senate in that period. He had a chairmanship of an enormously consequential committee, was called at that time the Interstate and Foreign Commerce Committee, and it dealt with everything from telecommunications to railroads to the electric utility industry. The FCC was under Wheeler's purview in that committee. So he had a huge fiefdom, if you will, lots and lots of influence in Washington and across the country. And I think he clearly relished that and used the power to his utmost. But by the same token, I think he considered himself very much in that tradition of being a bit of a maverick from beautiful Montana, and always thought of himself as a Westerner, who had come to the West by virtue of being born and raised in Massachusetts, but very much an adopted Westerner. And I think he continued to think, I'm just as home in Butte or at the cabin on Lake Macdonald as I am in, Sissy Patterson's apartment on DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C.
So
Sissy Patterson, by the way, was the publisher of the Washington Times-Herald, a conservative newspaper, generally a editorially conservative newspaper that supported Wheeler's views on foreign policy.
No discussion of your book could possibly be complete, or discussion really about Wheeler, without talking about court packing. And so I want to kind of ask the question about the genesis of Wheeler's break with Roosevelt, which has to be a hard thing to do, right? We have one of the most charismatic, popular presidents in U.S. history. And yet, both on the war and on the court, they're clearly at odds. Is it a combination of those two issues that caused their break? Is there one of them that you felt in your research was the straw that broke the camel's back between Roosevelt and Wheeler?
Well, the break was a long time coming, and it ultimately came, as you suggest, Doug, when the president, fresh off a historic landslide re-election in 1936, decides that he's going to propose legislation to fundamentally remake the U.S. Supreme Court, increase its size in one fell swoop from 9 members to 15 members. Everybody knew, of course, that those 6 new justices would be appointed in Roosevelt's image, if you will. They would be liberal New Dealers, and that the court would be transformed overnight from a fundamentally pretty centrist, conservative body to one that would essentially, in Wheeler's view, would rubber stamp anything that the president wanted to do. But the break started as early as 1932, I would say, 33, when Roosevelt is a brand new president. Wheeler believes that he should be in the inner circles of Roosevelt's administration, that he should be consulted more than he is being consulted on all kinds of things, particularly monetary policy, which was a big issue. And he had very strong views about, which Roosevelt did not embrace. So Wheeler, almost from the beginning of Roosevelt's administration, he feels shunted aside. There's one theory that he was overlooked as a vice presidential candidate in 1932, or maybe overlooked for a seat in the cabinet. I tend to downplay that a little bit, but could have been that he felt he was given short shrift in the consideration. And then by 1934, there was a real break over monetary policy with Roosevelt. And a story that I tell in the book that I think is emblematic of how the relationship had become so frayed at that point. Roosevelt takes a trip across northern Montana on the High Line, train trip, 1934, summer of 1934. He wants to do an inspection of Fort Peck under construction, the big dam in northeastern Montana. And Wheeler rides with him on the train from Spokane, Washington, all the way to the North Dakota border. And not once during that trip, which involved almost all of the political figures of any import in Montana, did Roosevelt mention Wheeler by name. He's standing on the back of the train car, making his impromptu speeches, a radio speech in Havre, and not once did he mention Wheeler. Didn't say, re-elect this guy who's on the ballot this year. It'd be like Donald Trump coming to Montana right now and neglecting to mention Steve Daines. It's just inconceivable. So it had to be a calculated snub on the part of Roosevelt to give Wheeler short shrift during that trip. And then by 1937, when Roosevelt rolls out this court packing plan, then the rupture is real and very, very public. And Wheeler's not at all bashful about saying, this will destroy Roosevelt's presidency. It didn't, of course, but it did hamper his domestic agenda. I don't think there's any doubt about that. The Senate eventually refused to take up Roosevelt's bill, and the court packing collapsed, which Wheeler was delighted to take credit for. But it really, really soured the relationships between the two of them. And Roosevelt was, if he came to dislike Wheeler, he certainly came to dislike Mrs. Wheeler, who was a good deal more conservative politically than her husband. And Roosevelt could not work his charm and his personal magnetism on either of the Wheelers.
Right, and Paul noted in the chat something that I thought you pointed out nicely in the book, that that Roosevelt could also just not quite get Wheeler's first name right when he would write him notes.
Yeah, the White House habitually misspelled his first name in correspondence back and forth between the two.
Yeah, which there were only 100 United States senators fewer back then, in fact. So that's probably not coincidental. It's funny, Montana's a small state, so Roosevelt did go over the Going to the Sun Highway in 1934 and gave one of his fireside chats from the now destroyed Two Medicine Lodge. There used to be a lodge at Two Medicine. And he did travel over the highway. It was Roosevelt, Wheeler, and Cooney. I mean, it's very interesting because I could pick up my cell phone today and I could call Burton K. Wheeler's grandson, Tom Coleman, and I could call Frank Cooney's grandson, Mike Cooney, and I could call Kate Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt's granddaughter. It's really interesting how small Montana is and how people tend to, stay involved, particularly in the case of Governor Cooney's grandson, who is now our lieutenant governor. There's a great tradition of that in Montana. So it's interesting to think about it, Montana as a small place, and then to think of some of the lions or icons anyway in the Mansfields and the Metcalfs and the Wheelers that Montana has produced.
Well, I think it's a remarkable story, and one of the things that I found so attractive about trying to understand Wheeler's career was at the same time to try to understand why Montana, a huge state geographically, but a small state population-wise, had produced so many very, very influential national political figures. Tom Walsh, Wheeler, Jim Murray from the 1930s to early 60s was a huge power in the United States Senate. Mansfield, of course, the longest serving majority leader in the Senate's history. Max Baucus, a 5-term senator with an enormous role on the finance committee on tax policy and healthcare policy for years and years. Going back on the Republican side, somebody like Governor and Senator Dixon back in the 20s and 30s. So it's a remarkable story of, I don't know, something in the water, I guess, but certainly have produced a remarkable range of political figures. Jeanette Rankin should be in that group as well. So phenomenal, yeah, really phenomenal. No other state, I would argue, has produced so many national figures in such a relatively narrow period of time.
Well, you're super generous with your time, and we don't want to take too much of it. But if folks have kind of some last questions for Marc, we're going to go. The next book is one of my all-time faves, Wolverine Way by our friend Doug Chadwick. I don't live at a NASCAR lot. I apologize for the background noise. The corner of our streets here in Columbia Falls at the old donut shop is a little loud. Wolverine Way is a terrific book about Wolverine research that happened in the park. And if you don't know a lot about Wolverine, because I did not, it's a great read. And Doug Chadwick will be with us. There is a book club page now, both in the shop, in the store, and then on our website. We have all the remainder of the books selected for the rest of the year, including George Bristol's magnificent book and Jim Robbins' book, The Wonder of Birds, and my friend Christine Carbo's novel about death in Glacier. Really, really great books coming up. So any last minute questions?
Doug, can I tell one final story that really didn't make it in the book, but pertains directly to the Wheeler cabin and Mrs. Wheeler? That
great. And then I've got Paul's gonna. No, Paul will have a question too, and then we'll wrap it up.
So people who are familiar with the Lake Macdonald area and West Glacier and Apgar will appreciate this story. In the early 1920s, the Wheelers and several of their children traveled to the Orient, Far East, on a trip, family trip. He obviously was doing political business in the Philippines and China, and enjoying himself immensely, I think. And during that trip, long story, I tell it in the book, they brought back with them a young Filipino man, Simi was his name, who lived with the Wheeler family from that point on until his death. After he went on to live beyond Mrs. Wheeler's lifespan. But he was sort of the cook and the houseboy, the helper to Mrs. Wheeler and her entertaining and doing shopping and taking care of the home, etc. And he always came to Glacier Park with them in the summer to spend the summer with the family. And the social event of the year, apparently, was when Simi and Lulu made apple strudel for all of their neighbors. And they made a huge amount of this apple strudel. Daughter Marion told me the story of rolling it out on this big dining room table that they had, big kitchen table that they had, and Simi and her mother assembling this apple strudel and baking it carefully, and then inviting all the neighbors from around the lake to come up for an afternoon tea and Lulu's and Simi's apple strudel. So says something about the social aspects of living around that beautiful, beautiful lake.
I think we may have to have apple strudel as a regular item out of the Wheeler cabin. That's a great story. Paul, I think you had your hand raised with a question.
Yes, really it's a comment and a favorable comment. My name is Paul Ulrich. I'm a retired civil appellate lawyer in Phoenix. Every year I give a presentation to a Montana luncheon group about someone or something or an institution relating to Montana or Montana history. This past February, I gave a presentation about Burton Wheeler, and I used your book as the basis for it. And part of what I do is I reduce the book to 30 pages. and hand it out, and it's available for people to take away with the thought that it's easier for them to read 30 pages than 480 pages. And, you know, I didn't know much about Wheeler before I saw the book. I thought it would be interesting. And I was really impressed, you know, having done that, by the fact that it was straightforward and clear and interesting. It was very detailed. It was a challenge to sort through it to meet my goal of 30 pages. I've sent that to Doug, and it's available for any of you to read or use. If anybody would want to do a presentation about Burton Wheeler, I've got your written material ready to go. But it was a very, you know, it took a while to do that, but it was relatively easy. I'm doing one now on Augustus Heinze by contrast, which is, I have 5 different source books and 5 different stories, and it's really hard to tell where the truth is in that. But Wheeler, this was really very good, and I thank you for doing it.
Well, thank you for your comments. I'm glad you enjoyed it. Thanks very much, Paul.
Mm-hmm.
Doug,
Yes.
I would close with this comment. Give my book a little plug, but not too much. In the back of the book, I printed Roosevelt's speech from Two Medicine Lodge, because it was a great speech on the CCC, etc. But I also printed up the notes that were taken on putting the trip together. And if you want to see how much detail goes into a presidential trip then and now, just read the notes in the book about getting Roosevelt off the train, up over going to the sun, down to Two Medicine, et cetera, et cetera. It's fascinating how much they did that we do today with our advanced teams.
Yeah. I often quote that speech because as we have 3 million visitors, you know, part of that speech, Roosevelt said, I've just had the most glorious day, and I wish every American could be here with me. And some days it feels like they are.
Yeah.
Well, happy birthday, George.
Thank you.
Again,
Thank you.
thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Mark.
And Mark Johnson,
Thank you, sir.
thank you so much for being a part of this. We so appreciate your sharing some time with us and sharing this great book with our group. It's really amazing. We'll look forward to our paths crossing soon.
I hope so. And thanks so much for doing this. I really enjoyed it.
You bet. Thanks so much. Thanks, everybody. Have a great night.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.